I'd say it's about time for another video essay. If you're paying attention to anything pop culture, you're noticing a resurgence in the 80s culture, either through 80s reboots, or shows taking place in the 80s, or those properties that embrace the pop culture of the time. I'll admit, the 80s were a strange time for me, mainly because I was only in the 80s for about 3 years. But those 3 years, I don't remember a thing about them. I'm much more of a 90s kid than I am an 80s kid. My pop culture references and those things that I grab onto are definitely more of a 90s Canadian kid. Those things like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Power Rangers, shows like Sailor Moon, and other things that were on The Zone on YTV. But this doesn't mean that I completely missed out on the 80s entirely. The 90s were kind of shaped by the 80s and what they had done to it. I loved 80s movies like Gremlins and Back to the Future. I loved and enjoyed Beetlejuice, Weird Science, and Ghostbusters, even though, if I'm being completely honest, I was more familiar and loved the subsequent TV shows that came out in the 90s that were based on those properties. But there's one thing that I definitely loved to devour when I was growing up, and that was the 80s fantasy movies. I'm surprised that more of these movies aren't getting the recognition, especially with the resurgence of such 80s material. And I'm talking more than just The Labyrinth being a resurgence. I'm talking like the deeper cuts, like Willow, The Last Unicorn, The Never-Ending Story, The Dark Crystal, Heavy Metal, Black Cauldron, The Secret of Nim. But then we come to my personal favorite out of all of these. The one that was released in 1985. A man by the name of Ridley Scott, hot off the presses from Blade Runner and Alien, decided to tackle the ultimate fantasy genre film of Legend. And if you know anything about Legend, it's probably how dope Tim Curry was as Darkness, the devil. But if you know any deep trivia about Legend, it's probably how insane the production problems of this film are. The fact that they literally built a forest inside the 007 soundstage and kind of blew it up because of the amount of the accumulated gas that it built up on the ceiling. Yeah, that actually happened. Or that the animals that they brought in made capturing dialogue impossible because they were so noisy. There was a mass ADR for any of the forest scenes just because of how noisy the animals were. And all of Gump's dialogues had to be redubbed because the directors and the producers didn't like the German accent. This kind of explains why he sounds so much like Meg and half of the other characters on cast.
What is a bell that does not ring? Yet its knell makes the angels sing.
The fact that we're looking at today that plays directly into this video essay is the fact that upon initial screenings, it tested so poorly that they had to kind of go back to the drawing board and recut many of the scenes, and they also decided to do a whole nother soundtrack. Yes, Legend is one of the only films that I know of that has two separate soundtracks. The original soundtrack that was done by Jerry Goldsmith had a much more orchestral and much more of a traditional soundtrack sound. And Jerry Goldsmith is no newcomer to the cinema. He had composed many scores from other beloved films, such as the original Star Trek movie, Chinatown, Rambo, even one of my favorites from the 80s, Gremlin, as well as another Scott film of Alien.
Like it.
But still, audiences didn't connect. It's hard to say if it was the score specifically, or if the movie was just lame, which it kinda is. But with another big fantasy success of the decade, such as The Never-Ending Story, having a soundtrack written by Giorgio Moroder and Klaus Dolgener, it only made sense that Scott and the producers would turn to another synthesized popular band of the time, my boys over at Tangerine Dream. Okay, I'm not going to do that again. I remember The Never-Ending Story for that strange atmosphere being created by those two creative geniuses throughout the score. As much as I loved Willow, the score by James Horner, another movie score legend, didn't make the movie memorable. The movie itself did that. And it's interesting that the same can be said about Legend and its two scores, but more on that later. Before I dive into why the Tangerine Dream score is the superior one, because it is, I do want to acknowledge two major sources that I use when constructing this video. Oliver Harper's video essay on this was very insightful and gave great background on why these two scores were used. He does lead a little bit more towards the Goldsmith being the superior of the two, which is fine, but wrong. And Diva from Music Hell has a wonderfully succinct essay about how the two are similar, but different. She agrees that Tangerine Dream score is the better score for the movie, because it is, but she also talks about how some of the iconic scenes work better with the Tangerine score. Notably, her points about the dance sequence and the reveal of the unicorns. Those two, oh boy. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Anyways, check these two guys out. I'll leave them at the end card so that you can watch this guy first and then make me seem all smart and be like, man, he knows his things, and then find out how much I actually stole from them. So first off, before even addressing which score is better or worse, let's see what each score brings to the table. I'll start with the first soundtrack, the Jerry Goldsmith soundtrack. The Goldsmith soundtrack is definitely much more of a traditional fantasy soundtrack. It uses orchestral movements and choir vocals. As Diva rightfully said in her review, it's equal parts John Williams and Igor Stravinsky, and boy does that hit it right on the head. And out of the two, I will admit, Goldsmith fits the tone the movie was going for. It's both bright and pleasant when we get to the forest scenes, and eerie and off-putting when we get to those dark depths of darkness's domain. You can tell that Goldsmith put this battle between innocence, purity, and love with temptation, darkness, and manipulation throughout the entire score. The track from Darkness, where Tim Curry's devil character appears to Lily, has this deep and menacing foundation showing the roots of the character and the setting. Goldsmith overlays it with very calming and soothing strings. Through the 7-minute soundscape, you can feel the battle raging on, even within the Darkness character that Curry plays. That horn section is definitely at odds with the string section and in a call and answer type of a duel. When the choir comes in at around the 6-minute mark, it feels like the haunted souls from Darkness's past is both cheering him on to continue to seduce Lily while also warding her away. This track is very active as engaging, as with the rest of Goldsmith's soundtrack. It grabs the attention of the audience with a bombastic sound. Another track that I'll draw attention to is near the beginning of the film with The Fairies. It has a quick playing and off-putting violin moment that Stravinsky himself would applaud. It holds the battle between innocent fun and a darker presence underneath. And the final piece that I want to talk about is the major thing that Tangerine Dream score lacks, and that is the song that Lily sings. This track captures the essence of innocence and love. The theme is also reprised throughout the soundtrack as a form of theme for Lily and innocence overall. The moment Lily is turned to the darkness, the theme is vacant from the soundtrack, which makes sense thematically. It's only when darkness is banished when that theme returns. This song just feels like the soft fantasy melody that has become the staple for so many other would-be copiers. And even in this song, where there's this unambiguous joy and playfulness, we have this underlying darkness that surrounds it. It shows even here, as innocent and decent as Lily is, she's still the one that seduces the unicorns and becomes the bride of darkness. So now let's turn to Tangerine Dream and what they did with the score. When approached by Sidney Seinberg to do the soundtrack, they only had 3 weeks to complete it. And instead of the soundtrack being rushed or unfinished, it feels fully formed and realized. This is much more of a synth-driven soundscape of music, drawing the listener and audience in rich tones and playful rhythms. So if you can't tell, I'm going to try my best at minimizing my bias between these two. By using that synthesizer to create and reproduce many of the classical instruments and sounds, such as the flutes, violins, and horns, it captures the same environment that Ridley has created in his sets. This inclusion of a synthetic soundscape also gives the soundtrack a much more unique and identifiable quality. Unlike many soundtracks of the time, there's very catchy melodies and themes that stick out. For example, that unicorn theme really enunciates the magical quality that is supposed to be encaptured by those mythical beasts. Tangerine Dream created a very light atmosphere to ground that song into and left a lot of space for an echo effect. This atmosphere feels like a fantasy forest. When the synthesized harpsichord comes in as the rhythm, it feels as though the sun is coming through those trees. And finally, when we have the synth guitar sound, it feels as though it really is that magical creature that's breaking through the water that you're hearing. And this level of detail is also found within the dance, where Lily is being seduced by darkness. It almost starts the same way too, with just wisps of sound coming through and that echo reverberating the walls. But this time there's a lot less padding. We just have the synth organ providing a strange little waltz. It almost feels as though it's a carnival ride, but as it's set in a minor key, it shrouds itself in eerily darkness. Much like the seduction, it's a playful, hesitant rhythm until Lily finally joins in the dance. The score also uses variations on Love by the Sun, which is one of the 2 singles that is found on this album. This comes in one of the opening tracks, which is the title track of Legend. And has sections from the unicorn theme in it, and again at the end of the movie. It kind of does what Lily's Cottage theme did with the Goldsmith album, but it plays it a little bit different. It also features the legendary, see what I did there? Vocalist of John Anderson from Yes, and it really feels like a John Anderson song. It has a beautiful melody, a fantastic build-up, and a wonderful payoff. The other single that came off of the score from Tangerine Dream, which is found at the ending credits, is Your Love Strong Enough? This song was written and performed by Bryan Ferry and has the legendary, okay, I'll stop, David Gilmour on guitars. Even with Gilmour's guitar star power, I'm not a big fan of this track, as it just doesn't fit the album, and it definitely feels like it was there to sell tickets. Even with Is Your Love Strong Enough having a music video, the soundtrack that Tangerine Dream created fits this world that Scott created. It creates a very real environment that sucks you into the world with its unique identity. Much like Vangelis did for Blade Runner, another Scott film, it provides a second character for the world that was created around it. Now, if you really want to trip, you should check out Brian K. Verrett's orchestral interpretation of the Tangerine Dream soundtrack. It kind of blends the ideas of the 2 scores together, and in some ways it works by maintaining the identity set up by Tangerine Dream and having a balance of the light and dark from the Goldsmith soundtrack. But there is a little bit of an uncanny valley going on that is a bit on the disturbing side. Either way, if you're a fan of both Legend soundtracks, it's worth a listen. As Diva and Oliver have pointed out in their own video essays, and ones that I'll echo, is that the soundtrack that you attach to is usually the one that you're more familiar with their works, or which one you were presented growing up. Both soundtracks are wonderful scores and do very different things for the film. As I grew up with the Tangerine Dream score, and with many Tangerine Dream albums, that's the one I tend to lean into. In fact, I didn't even realize that this movie had 2 scores until I bought it on Blu-ray a couple months ago and plopped it in to find out that there was a completely different score on the director's cut. After viewing it with the Goldsmith score, I felt the Goldsmith orchestral score did change the feels for me, and not necessarily in a good way.
This isn't real.
Oh, it is.
And part of this was just the unfamiliarity with it. I was expecting to get enveloped in the world that Tangerine Dream created, but instead Goldsmith's score just felt like a typical fantasy soundtrack. Tangerine Dream's score gave Legend a fully independent quality that separated it from any other fantasy film. I guess the Neverending Story is the closest one, but even still, those catchy moments that came from the Loved by the Sun and the unicorn theme that I got shivers over due to its synthesized 80s goodness had been stripped away for more of a film score song. Those 2 scenes that I love the most in the film, the reveal of the unicorns and the dance with Lily and her darkness dress, were gone. It felt flat and darker with the Goldsmith score when compared to the themes introduced by Tangerine Dream.
No, this is just more fairy glamour.
With the reveal of the unicorns in the Tangerine Dream score, there's a real build-up and an anticipation of the creatures coming into view within the river clearing. So when the unicorns do appear, we have this crescendo in the score, which adds to the mythic quality. But in the Goldsmith score, there's no real build-up, they're just shown. So where Tangerine Dream really shows the mythical quality of the unicorns, the Goldsmith score really shows the vulnerability and how fragile they are. Turning to the dance, the Tangerine Dream score is a literal dance. It's seductive and creepy, drawing you in so you can understand why Lily is being put on this spell. Yet with the Goldsmith score, it's less of a dance and more of a warning. It's a swirling of choir vocals that creates this strange spell that's horrifying. So where the Tangerine Dream score, we're drawn in with Lily and experiencing her transformation, in Goldsmith's score, we're witnessing her transformation in horror. And I think at the end of the day, this is why I'm not a big fan of the Goldsmith's version when compared to the Tangerine Dream, because it just doesn't draw me in. As I've mentioned before in my reviews, it's not that I dislike albums or a style of music, it's more about how much I connect with a piece of music. And upon my first viewing of that Goldsmith score, I didn't connect with it at all. But the more I heard Goldsmith's score, as it was presented in the film, as well as on its own, the more I felt as though there was a lot to love and discover about it. The music that's presenting this contrast of light and dark, innocence and evil, beauty and the sublime was spot on in the Goldsmith score. Sure, it may not be as catchy or identifiable as the Tangerine Dream score, but it holds some very beautiful moments. And the Tangerine Dream score isn't perfect. It does have a lot of callbacks to the unicorn theme and Loved by the Sun without presenting too many variations on it. Also, the Tangerine Dream soundtrack does lack that cottage song that Lily sings, and it feels as though the score and the movie had a hole without it. When Lily sings that song, I could understand why the unicorns would be beckoned to it and why Jack would wake up after such a brutal beating. It's the very definition of playful innocence. But still, at the end of the day, I can't help but love that Tangerine Dream soundtrack. I do understand why people love the Goldsmith score and bemoan it being discarded in the theatrical version. Luckily, it did surface in the record stores to buy on soundtrack from the beginning of its release, as well as in 1992 on CD, even if it did take another 20 years to resurface and be cut into the film itself. I'm glad both versions are now available to enjoy. Those who love the Goldsmith score can now enjoy it and a longer edition of the film, and those who love the Tangerine Dream score, like this guy, can still enjoy the world that Tangerine Dream created. So it's clear that Legend, even though isn't necessarily a great film, it's still one of my favorites. A lot of that has to be attributed to the score itself, and the fact that it has two scores just means I get to enjoy it twice. So that's about it about me rambling on about Legend's soundtrack. What did you guys think? Which one do you prefer? Do you love the Tangerine Dream soundtrack? Do you love the Goldsmith soundtrack? Let me know of your own thoughts about this by commenting down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.